Hello, I'm Brandy Agerbeck of LooseTooth.com, and I help you reclaim drawing as your best thinking tool so you can see and shape your life and your work in new ways. Today, I want to share with you the 5-step process of the book, The Idea Shapers, the power of putting your thinking into your hands. So, today I'm going to describe the 5-step process using dots. So we're going to look at the thinking process, the visual thinking processes, a little abstractly today, using dots as our example. So the very first step in the idea shaper process is chunk. Now what that means is you begin a project, you begin some kind of complex project you're working on, whether it's writing a paper, creating a presentation, trying to prioritize everything you have to do. It may be coming to a decision. It could be problem solving. There's lots and lots of fantastic things that visual thinking can help you do. Again, using drawing as your best thinking tool. So that first step of chunk starts with a big pile of stuff. A big pile of resources, a big pile of information. Sometimes when it's about working through your own ideas, it can just feel like all that stuff that's in your head. It's overwhelming you and making it hard to figure out where to go next. So in that chunk step, that first step, we point to that big pile of information and we're pulling out the most relevant chunks. So I go through my pile of information and I say, aha, this is something important to whatever my objective is. This will help me write that paper. Or, this is one of the points of parts of the puzzle I'm trying to solve. So you go through this big pile of information and you pull out all those relevant chunks. All right, so I have pulled all the relevant information for my project out of all the different resources at my disposal. Now again, this is an abstraction, but think of this as all that information that you are using, sort of the big pile of stuff, and then what you're doing in this first chunk step in the idea shapers is pulling out what's relevant, what is useful to your task at hand. So the main mental process in the chunk step is discernment, figuring out what is relevant, what is useful out of whatever your pile of sources are. So that is step 1. So within the first step of chunk, we've got 4 idea shapers, and each of those are about pulling out relevant information and deciding what surface you're going to put it on. Now, let's look at this pile of relevant chunks of information. All of these are going to help us write that paper, craft that presentation, make that decision, solve that problem, whatever your objective is, whatever the task is at hand. Now again, these dots are standing in for pieces of vital information. So let's talk about step number 2. 2 is sort and group. And very simply, what we're doing with the sort and group phase is we're looking at those chunks and saying, okay, what patterns do I see in this information? So where am I going to put, how am I going to sort this information and put it in groupings that make sense for what I'm trying to do? Now, a lot of the mental processing that's happening in this second step of sort and group is about having different filters that help you filter out information. What needs to be in the drawing, what doesn't. That was a lot of step one. With the information you have that's relevant to your project, what kind of groupings do you see form? What kind of patterns do you see emerge? Let's get these dots actually on this piece of paper so I can demonstrate a little bit more about what happens in the second step of the idea shapers. Now you can see how these different ideas have been sorted out and grouped. So similar ideas are grouped together, dissimilar ideas are pushed apart. And in this step, our idea shapers are specific visual thinking concepts like the cluster and the buffer. So with the cluster, we are putting similar things together and using proximity to visually show that these 9 items are all very similar to each other because they're huddled close together. So throughout this example with our dots, you can see different groupings that because they're huddled together, the similar ideas are grouped together, and the reason the clusters work is because you have the buffer. And the buffer is the white space between those clusters that help you see one grouping from the next. So that's just a couple examples of the idea shapers specifically described in the second step of the book. The third step in our process in the idea shaper book is connect and contain. And this is about showing the relationship between different ideas. So we've got our groupings sorted out on our page. And now what we're doing is we are using lines between ideas to connect them and show the relationships, and lines around ideas to contain ideas and talk about what are the qualities of those items within those containers. Now I will use my yellow pen to demonstrate some of those lines between and lines around that help to further describe the ideas on the page. For example, between these two ideas, I could create a pair of double-ended arrows. This helps describe that these two particular pieces of information are rely on each other, are symbiotic, as an example. Also, what I could do is take this main cluster in the center and label it. So here I could say that this describes all 9 pieces that are in this grouping. And I could create a line around it to help further illustrate that those 9 things belong together. These ideas all group together in a pattern among my thinking. We can also use lines to show things like tension. So perhaps these two ideas are grouped together, but there's a lot of tension between them. We could certainly use lines. Maybe there's actually a connection between this group of 9 and this outlier over here. So one thing we could do is make a dotted line to say, hey, I think this might be related to that. That's something I'm going to test in my drawing. But I'm using a different type of line to demonstrate that relationship. So very easily you can see, very quickly and easily you can see that there is a lot you can do with very simple lines, again, between ideas and around ideas that help show the character. Now perhaps I'm really excited about this particular grouping, and a different kind of container I can put around this is a set of these spark lines. So that shows that I am super excited about those 3 things. So those, again, are very simple examples of how lines can really help clarify the relationships between ideas and the characteristics of groupings of ideas. That is our connect and contain step number 3. Our next step is our little pinky finger over here and that is using scale. Scale works in two different ways. One is, what is the size of the canvas you're working on? So maybe you're working with a giant sheet of paper to expand your thinking. Maybe you're working with an itty-bitty piece of paper to help get concise and clarify your thinking. Like if you only have the size of a postage stamp, how would you describe this idea? If you had to fit this whole project on a one inch button, what would you say? How would you symbolize all of that complexity? So that's the first side of scale. The other side of scale is, what is the size of the ideas in relationship to each other? Right now, in this drawing, in this abstracted dot drawing, everything is kind of the same size as everything else. And I think this is one of the most powerful parts of the idea shapers of visual thinking, is really discerning and deciding how do these pieces fit together. Because this is not how ideas actually work. There are ideas that are bigger and overarching. There are ideas that are smaller, supporting ideas. So now let's use our dots, bring in these new bigger dots and smaller dots to help show how to use scale. Let's see how this drawing changes when we introduce scale. Again, each one of these dots represents an idea, but unlike this example, not every idea is the same size. And a big part of visual thinking is finding the structure of what you're doing, seeing how different ideas fit together. So you may have overarching ideas with several ideas underneath them. You may find this cluster is all about the same size. So you're always thinking about, how do these pieces fit together? Again, to help create that big picture for yourself, to help make meaning for yourself, to help create clarity for yourself. So let's look at what the heck this drawing looks like when we start to shift the scale of those ideas. Again, all that wonderful visual thinking when we're trying to figure out how the pieces fit together. Let's look at some of the visual choices in our dot diagram here. So we went from this set of dots, and now you can see some changes have been made. A very large dot has been added as a placeholder for the title. This is what you would name this entire drawing. Turns out that this grouping in the center of 9 dots really turned out to be 3 main ideas with 3 subsets or steps below each of those 3 ideas. And as I thought it through, there actually ended up being a sequence. So this acts as our first step, then we move here to number 2, then we move to here, number 3, and turns out that little dot that was down there is the result. So again, we're using scale, we're using connectors, and in this case, we're also using sequence to create a flow between all of these ideas. And then you could actually connect these little guys to the big guys to show that they are all, each one of these are sub-points to each of these main points. Up here, we could still have this as perhaps our 3 keys. So let's say this is 3 things we absolutely want to keep in mind as we're looking at this process. Turns out this little grouping over here was a 1 main idea, and here we had the sort of tense option over here, and here we had a really strong smooth option over there. Now these 4 dots that were up here in the upper corner, maybe those actually fit into some kind of visual model. So we could put these in a 2x2 matrix. Again, these are just examples of different types of relationships you may find between different ideas. Now again, down here, this lovely little pair here was very symbiotic, and I shifted the orientation of those two dots. Here, because they're stacked on top of each other, it feels like this may be the lead and this may be the subordinate. And now by putting them side by side, they look more equal to each other. Again, this is a lot of those visual thinking decisions you make about proximity, about placement, and how they change the meaning of the ideas. This grouping over here, those 6 dots, you know what? It turned out it was one main idea, and off of that main idea were 2 main points, and this one had 3 details. This one didn't have any subdetails. So here we could say here's 2 main points off of this guy, and here are 2 subpoints off of this one. Now, all depending on what your process is, this may be the more viable option. So imagine that you were looking at this idea and you were thinking, well, I want to go with the one that has the most possibilities. So then you would choose this one. Now, flip that. What if those little dots were obstacles? If that were the case, then you'd want to go with this choice because you don't see any obstacles in your way. So you can see how putting all these different ideas in relationship to each other can really help you think through a project, to help problem solve, to help make decisions and help prioritize. And lastly, just these little 3 guys in the corner, when it turns out, instead of being equal to every other idea on the page, they're just kind of 3 little points over here, little details, and maybe we put bullet points beside them and group them in a container. So again, I know this is an abstracted example, but hopefully it helps demonstrate some of the very, very, very simple visual thinking skills that components that go into visual thinking more broadly. And that is exactly what the Idea Shaper book is teaching you. How to think about scale, how to think about those connectors, how to think about how all those different ideas relate to each other. Now this is what happens after those first 4 steps. You step back and you grasp your information in new ways. This is the most exciting part. To me, this is the synthesis. This is the new meaning made. This is when you look at what you've done and you go, I have a new level of understanding with this project, with this decision I'm trying to make, with this speech I'm trying to craft, the presentation I'm trying to craft, or the paper I'm trying to write. That's when we create that new meaning for ourselves. That's when we create clarity. So all of these steps I have described to you in this process with these dots are in the Idea Shapers, the power of putting your thinking into your own hands. So hop on over to Amazon.com, order your own copy, and learn much, much more about how you can use drawing as your best thinking tool. I'm Brandy Agerbeck of LooseTooth.com, and thank you so much for watching.